Holmes said. 2 days have already been lost. Is there no other evidence, no small detail that survived from Colonel Elias Openshaw's papers? John searched his coat and said, there is one thing. He produced a discolored blue sheet. On the day my uncle burned the documents, I noticed scraps of this same blue paper among the ashes. This single page apparently fell to the floor and escaped the fire. I believe it came from my uncle's private diary, and the handwriting is certainly his. Holmes moved the lamp closer. The ragged edge showed that the sheet had been torn from a book. At the top was the date, March 1869. The first entry read, 4th. Hudson came. Same old platform. The next read, 7th. Set the pips on Macaulay, Paramore, and John Swain of Street Augustine. Later entries said, 9th. Macaulay cleared. 10th. John Swain cleared. 12th. Visited Paramore. All well. The meaning was not yet fully clear, but the page directly connected orange pips with named people and actions taken against them. Holmes returned the page and said, you must leave immediately. We have no time for further discussion because the threat has come from London. John asked. What should I do? Holmes said, put this blue page into the brass box. Add a note stating that your uncle burned every other paper and that this is the only sheet left. Make the statement convincing, close the box, and place it on the garden sundial exactly as the warning demanded. Revenge can wait. Our first duty is to remove the immediate danger. Afterward, we can solve the mystery and use the law against those responsible. John said, you have given me new hope. I promise to follow every instruction. Holmes warned him, waste no time, and guard yourself carefully. The danger is real and immediate. John said, I will return by train from Waterloo. Holmes answered, it is not yet 9, and the crowded streets offer some protection, but you still cannot be too cautious. John said, I am armed. Holmes replied, good. I will begin my investigation tomorrow morning. John asked, then I shall see you in Horsham? Holmes corrected him, no, the secret is in London, and London is where I will search. John promised, I will return in 1 or 2 days with news about the box. He shook hands with us and stepped back into the screaming wind and rain. After John left, Holmes sat silently before the fire, then lit his pipe and watched the smoke. He said no case, except perhaps the sign of 4 had seemed more fantastic. Watson asked, do you already understand the danger? Holmes answered, there is no real doubt about its nature. Watson asked, who or what is KKK, and why is it hunting this family? Holmes explained, if a reasoner fully understands one fact, he should be able to reconstruct the chain that produced it and predict what follows. That method requires useful knowledge. I do not try to remember everything. I keep my brain attic supplied with information needed for criminal investigation and store other facts in books. Watson replied, my old list gave you little interest in philosophy or astronomy, deep knowledge of local soils, unusual chemistry, incomplete anatomy, unmatched records of crime, and skill with violin, boxing, fencing, and law. Holmes smiled and said, please hand me the volume under K in the American Encyclopedia. Now let us organize the case from the beginning. Colonel Elias abandoned a warm, successful life in Florida for isolation in an English country house. A man of his age would not make that change without a powerful reason. His secrecy and fear suggest that someone or something in America drove him away. The 3 threatening letters can reveal what followed him. Watson said, the first letter came from Pondicherry, the second from Dundee, and the third from East London. All 3 places are seaports. Holmes agreed, exactly. The sender, or senders, were probably traveling aboard a ship. Now compare the time between warning and death. Elias died 7 weeks after the Pondicherry letter, while Joseph died only 3 or 4 days after the Dundee warning. The difference was not simply postal distance. A mail steamer carried each letter faster than the vessel carrying the killers. The men traveled in a sailing ship. They mailed the pips when starting toward a victim, then acted after their slower vessel reached the same port. That explains the 7-week delay from India and the much shorter delay from Dundee. The London postmark means the killers are already nearby, so John may have almost no time. The papers were important enough for several determined men to commit repeated murders and disguise them as accidents. One person alone could not arrange 2 deaths so perfectly that both deceived a coroner's jury. Therefore, KKK is not the initials of one individual. It is the symbol of an organized group. Holmes asked. Have you heard of the Ku Klux Klan? Watson answered. I have not. Holmes opened the encyclopedia and read aloud. Holmes read, the Klan was a secret society formed by former Confederate soldiers after the American Civil War. It developed branches in several southern states, including Florida. It used terror and murder for political purposes, especially against black voters and others who opposed its goals. Before attacking, the organization sent a recognized warning. Depending on the district, the token might be oak leaves, melon seeds, or orange pips. A marked person could submit or flee. Anyone who resisted was usually killed in a strange way, and the organization was so disciplined that few crimes were traced to their perpetrators. The Klan's organized power suddenly weakened in 1869, although later outbreaks continued. Holmes concluded, that date matches Elias's departure from America with the register and diary. Stealing the records may have helped damage the society, and they could expose important men in the South. The surviving diary page fits the pattern. Set the pips means send warnings. Cleared probably means that Macaulay and Swain fled or obeyed, while visited Paramore suggests punishment. Holmes believed John's only immediate chance was to return the surviving page as instructed. Nothing else could be done that night, so he took up his violin while we waited for morning. The storm cleared by breakfast. Holmes expected a busy day examining London shipping records and said he might visit Horsham later, depending on what the first inquiries revealed. While waiting for coffee, I opened the newspaper. A headline made me call out, Holmes, you are too late. The report was titled, Tragedy near Waterloo Bridge. Between 9 and 10 the previous night, a police constable heard a cry for help and a splash near the river. The darkness and storm prevented rescue even after several passers-by tried to help. Water police later recovered the body of John Openshaw, identified by an envelope in his pocket. The newspaper assumed he had hurried toward Waterloo Station, lost his way in the extreme darkness, and fallen from one of the small riverside landings used by steamboats. The riverfront also had little lighting. There were no visible signs of violence, so authorities again called the death accidental and suggested that the dangerous landing stages needed attention. Holmes sat in shaken silence. He said John had come to him for protection, yet he had sent the young man away to his death. His grief turned to anger. The embankment was not the direct route to the station, so the killers must have lured John away from the crowded bridge to a darker landing. Holmes declared the case personal. He would act as his own police, build the entire web of evidence, and let the authorities take the criminals only when the trap was complete. I spent the day attending patients. Holmes returned to Baker Street near 10 that night, pale, exhausted, and so hungry that he tore bread from a loaf and swallowed it with water. He had eaten nothing since breakfast because the search occupied every moment. Nevertheless, he said the gang was now in the hollow of his hand. Holmes took an orange, removed 5 pips, and sealed them in an envelope. Inside the flap he wrote, S.H. for J.O., Sherlock Holmes for John Openshaw. He addressed the warning to Captain James Calhoun of the barque Lone Star, Savannah, Georgia. Calhoun was the leader, and Holmes intended the gang's own symbol to reach him before arrest. Holmes had spent the day studying Lloyd's shipping registers and old newspapers. He followed every substantial vessel that had called at Pondicherry in January and February 1883. 36 ships appeared in the records. The Lone Star attracted attention because its name referred to an American state even though the vessel had been listed as sailing from London. Holmes then searched the Dundee records. The Lone Star had been there in January 1885, exactly when Joseph received the second warning. Finally, he checked ships recently in London. The Lone Star had arrived the previous week and left with the early tide that morning, bound for Savannah. Telegrams to Gravesend showed that the ship had passed downriver. With an easterly wind, it was probably already beyond the Goodwin Sands and near the Isle of Wight. The captain and his 2 mates were the only American-born men aboard. The rest of the crew were Finns and Germans. A stevedore confirmed that all 3 Americans had been away from the ship on the night John died. Holmes's warning would reach Savannah by fast mail before the sailing ship. A cable would also tell the Savannah police that Calhoun and the 2 mates were wanted in England for murder. The plan was logical, but nature intervened. That year's equinoctial gales continued with exceptional violence, and the Lone Star never reached Savannah. Much later, a broken stern post marked LS was seen far out in the Atlantic. No crew or other wreckage was found. John Openshaw's killers never received the 5 pips Holmes sent them, and no court judged their crimes. The shattered timber was the only answer ever given about the fate of the Lone Star.